blindfolded man sits in silence, his hands bound, the fabric of his uniform torn and stained with dirt and blood. Denis, a machine gunner in an invading army, claims he is just another pawn in a game far bigger than himself. He says he never wanted to fight, that he was dragged into a war he didn't understand. But his actions, destruction, death, and despair, speak louder than his excuses. Now, as a prisoner of war, Denis insists he's a victim. Yet the stories of those who survived his weapon's fire suggest otherwise. Who is Denis, really? And how did he become a face of devastation in a war he claims isn't his? The seeds of the war in Ukraine were sown long before the first shots were fired. For years, Russia's state-controlled media painted a vivid picture of a neighboring nation teetering on the edge of chaos. Ukrainians were branded as radicals, Nazis, or puppets of the West, anything to justify intervention. This relentless propaganda machine didn't just create a narrative. It rewrote reality for millions of Russians, including soldiers like Denis. Denis was an ordinary man from Chusovoy, a quiet industrial town in Russia's Perm Krai. Like many in his generation, he grew up hearing tales of a strong, unified Russia, a nation that protected its people and reclaimed its place on the global stage. But behind those tales were economic stagnation, limited opportunities, and systemic corruption. The army offered stability in a chaotic world, or so it seemed. When the mobilization orders came, young men across Russia were told they were defending their homeland, stopping an existential threat. In reality, these soldiers were pawns in a high-stakes geopolitical conflict. Denis was one of them, swept up in the fervor of duty, the fear of punishment, and the allure of propaganda. The messaging was clear: obey, fight, and bring glory to your nation, or face the consequences of dissent. For Denis, the decision to enlist was not one of heroism but survival. Fines, imprisonment, or worse awaited those who refused. The machine that recruited him was impersonal, cold, and efficient. It turned farmers, factory workers, and students into soldiers overnight. But this wasn't a war to protect Russia. It was an invasion into a sovereign Ukraine. And for Denis, it would soon become a brutal awakening to the lies he had once believed. Denis's story is one of contradictions and devastating revelations. As he sits in captivity, his words are carefully chosen, his tone cautious. He speaks of loyalty and duty, yet his actions tell a far darker tale. He recalls the chaos of Kharkiv, where his unit moved through destroyed neighborhoods, crumbling homes, shattered windows, and streets lined with the wreckage of lives torn apart. Denis manned the machine gun, following orders to fire, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, what lay in his line of sight. His commanders promised liberation, but to the Ukrainians left to bury their dead, Denis and his comrades were anything but saviors. Then came the friendly fire incident. A storm of shells rained down on his position, Russian artillery, blind to the fact they were hitting their own. Denis describes the terror of that night, the deafening explosions, the screams of his comrades, the confusion as smoke filled the air. He survived, but barely. Shrapnel tore into his body, leaving him injured and defenseless. As the dust settled, Denis realized the true cost of war was paid by its own soldiers as much as by its victims. But perhaps the most painful blow came from home. When Denis was allowed to contact his mother, her response was colder than he could have imagined. She refused to speak with him. To her, he was not a hero, not a victim, just another lost son in a war that should never have been fought. Her silence echoed louder than any artillery, cutting deeper than any wound. These moments, destroyed towns, the horror of friendly fire, and the rejection by his own family, defined Denis's journey. They are glimpses into the unraveling of a man who once believed he was fighting for something greater, only to find himself lost in the wreckage of lies and betrayal. Denis grew up in Chusovoy, a small industrial town in Russia's Perm Krai, where the monotony of factory chimneys and gray skies mirrored the lives of its residents. The town, once a beacon of Soviet industrial ambition, had become a shadow of its former self. Steel mills, the lifeblood of Chusovoy, operated with half the workforce they once had, leaving many families to scrape by on dwindling incomes and fading hope. His family lived in a cramped two-room apartment in one of the town's many Khrushchevkas, low-rise housing blocks built for Soviet workers. The paint on the walls had long since peeled, and the ceilings sagged from years of damp winters. Denis's father, a welder, came home each day with hands cracked from cold and soot, his silence a testament to the exhaustion that consumed him. His mother, a schoolteacher, spent her evenings preparing lessons by the light of a dim lamp, her meager salary barely covering the essentials. They were a family bound not by shared dreams, but by shared struggles. For Denis, childhood offered few escapes from the grind of daily life. The playground near his apartment was little more than a rusting metal frame, and the streets were often deserted save for stray dogs and the occasional lorry rumbling toward the steel plant. His solace was the calm river. He would sit on its banks for hours, staring at the horizon, imagining a world beyond Chusovoy's limits, a world where opportunities weren't out of reach. In school, Denis was neither remarkable nor invisible. Teachers described him as quiet but resourceful, a boy who could fix a broken desk or rig a game from scraps he found lying around. He once crafted a kite from old newspapers and sticks, a simple creation that brought the children of his block together for an afternoon. It wasn't just ingenuity, it was resilience, a skill born from necessity. As Denis entered his teenage years, the weight of Chusovoy's decay pressed harder. Factories continued to close, unemployment surged, and the town seemed to crumble around him. Alcoholism took hold of many households, and Denis saw friends drop out of school, lured by petty crimes or the promise of quick money. Yet he stayed, not out of hope, but because he didn't know where else to go. The army recruiters began appearing more frequently in Chusovoy during this time, wearing crisp uniforms that stood in stark contrast to the shabby streets. Their promises of a better life, steady pay, training, and a chance to see the world found eager listeners among the town's youth. Denis watched as one by one his classmates enlisted, trading the bleak familiarity of Chusovoy for the unknown of military life. For Denis, the decision came not with excitement but resignation. His father had fallen ill, unable to work as much as before, and his mother's paychecks could no longer stretch far enough. The recruiter's assurances of financial stability and respectability were too tempting to ignore. On the day he signed his papers, Denis's mother packed him a small bag and hugged him tightly, her tears wetting the fabric of his jacket. "Do your duty, but don't lose yourself," she whispered, a plea that he would come to remember with painful clarity. As Denis boarded the train that would take him to basic training, he looked back at the only home he had ever known. Chusovoy had shaped him, its struggles becoming his own, its limits defining his aspirations. He believed, perhaps naively, that this new chapter might offer something more. But what awaited him was not the escape he had hoped for, but a journey into chaos and moral disintegration, a descent that would forever mark him and the place he had called home. Denis left Chusovoy as a young man seeking purpose. He would return, if at all, a changed man bearing the scars of choices that were not entirely his own. The boy who dreamed by the riverbanks would become a soldier in a war he barely understood, a symbol of a system that consumed people like him with impunity. Denis's family was the anchor that held him steady in Chusovoy, though their struggles weighed heavily on him from an early age. His father, Anatoly, was a welder at the local steel plant, a job that demanded long hours for little pay. The work was grueling, and the conditions relentless, especially during Chusovoy's harsh winters when temperatures plunged and the factory floors were colder than the snow-covered streets outside. By the time Denis was a teenager, Anatoly's health had begun to decline. His joints stiffened from years of labor, his chest heavy from inhaling metal fumes. Denis's mother, Lyudmila, carried the family's emotional burden. As a schoolteacher, she was among the few in the community who still believed in the value of education, though she often wondered if it would make any difference. Her job was as thankless as it was exhausting, with the education system in decay and her wages often delayed. Lyudmila worked tirelessly, budgeting down to the kopeck to keep the family afloat, her optimism slowly eroded by years of financial strain. For Denis, their sacrifices were a constant reminder of his own obligations. He often heard the hushed conversations late at night, his parents discussing overdue bills, the rising cost of utilities, and whether they could afford a doctor for Anatoly's worsening condition. Though they tried to shield him from their worries, Denis understood the unspoken truth. The family needed more than what they had, and he would have to help. His role in the household shifted as he grew older. During summers, Denis worked odd jobs, hauling scrap metal, chopping firewood, repairing fences for neighbors. The money he earned was meager but necessary, often going straight into the household budget. At times, he resented how much responsibility had fallen on him, but he also felt a deep sense of pride in contributing to his family's survival. Chusovoy's economic realities left few options for young men like Denis. The factory, once the town's beating heart, now operated at half capacity, laying off workers in waves. Opportunities outside of physical labor were rare, and those who tried to leave often found themselves drawn back by the gravity of poverty. Many of Denis's friends succumbed to despair, some to alcohol, others to crime. He envied those who could still dream of a different future, but for him, practicality always won out. The turning point came when Anatoly suffered a severe injury at the steel plant, one that left him unable to work for months. The family's precarious finances unraveled quickly. Lyudmila tried to pick up the slack by taking on private tutoring sessions, but the extra hours drained her. Denis saw the toll it was taking on his parents and knew that his odd jobs wouldn't be enough. The recruiter's pitch, which he had ignored for so long, began to take root in his mind. The military, they promised, offered stability. It was a chance to earn a steady income, to support his family, and maybe even escape Chusovoy for something better. The recruiter painted a picture of respect and purpose, though Denis suspected it wasn't as noble as it sounded. Still, with his family's needs growing more urgent, the choice felt less like an opportunity and more like a necessity. When Denis told his parents of his decision, the reaction was mixed. Anatoly, though proud, seemed pained by the idea of his son following orders in a system he mistrusted. Lyudmila was openly distraught, fearing what might happen to Denis but understanding why he felt compelled to go. The night before he left, she stayed up with him, packing his bag and sewing a small cross into the lining of his uniform. "To keep you safe," she said, her voice trembling. Denis didn't have the heart to tell her that no charm, no matter how heartfelt, could protect him from what lay ahead. By the time he signed the contract, Denis was no longer the boy who dreamed by the riverbank. He had become a man shaped by the weight of responsibility, driven not by ambition but by obligation. The army didn't represent hope or heroism to him. It was simply a means to an end. But even as he donned the uniform and boarded the train, Denis couldn't shake the feeling that he was trading one kind of struggle for another, one that would demand far more than he ever thought possible. The first whispers of mobilization in Chusovoy were met with a mix of disbelief and unease. Rumors spread quickly. Men were being summoned to recruitment centers, some returning home pale and shaken, others not returning at all. Denis tried to push the stories aside, focusing instead on his daily routines, but the shadow of conscription loomed larger with each passing week. Denis didn't see himself as a soldier. He had no particular allegiance to the grand narratives of Russian nationalism. His world was his family, his town, and the quiet life he had always known. When the letter arrived, its envelope stark and official, his heart sank. It was an order to report to the nearest military recruitment office. Denis ignored it, hoping it might be a mistake, or that they'd forget about him in the chaos of bureaucracy. But the system didn't forget. Days later, a second notice arrived, this time with a warning of penalties for failure to comply. Denis's reluctance turned to dread. He had heard of others who had resisted, fined exorbitant amounts, or threatened with imprisonment. Stories circulated of men dragged from their homes in the dead of night, their families powerless to intervene. It wasn't just the law that enforced compliance. It was fear, a tool wielded as effectively as any weapon. When Denis finally presented himself at the recruitment office, he did so under protest. The room was crowded with other men, their faces a patchwork of anger, resignation, and quiet despair. The recruiters, dressed in crisp uniforms, exuded an air of authority that dared no one to argue. Denis was given a stack of papers to sign, and as his pen hovered over the dotted line, he hesitated. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The officer didn't look up from his desk. "You don't want to know," he replied curtly. Denis signed the papers. What followed was a crash course in compliance. He was told where to report, what to pack, and when to leave. There was no time to think, only to follow orders. The fines he had feared were no longer a threat, but the price of his submission felt far greater. His reluctance lingered, though there was no room for it in the rigid world of military training. Denis's first days at the barracks were a blur of shouted commands and physical drills. The trainers didn't care about his lack of enthusiasm. They cared about efficiency. He was handed a rifle and told to shoot, given a uniform and told to march. There was no time to question, only to obey. Yet Denis couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong, that he was an imposter among the more eager recruits. Conversations in the barracks revealed that many of his comrades felt the same way. Most were not patriots. They were farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers swept up in a machine that gave them little choice. Some spoke openly about their anger, while others kept their heads down, focusing only on surviving the ordeal. Denis found himself in the latter group, staying quiet, avoiding attention, and counting down the days until he could leave. But leaving wasn't an option, and Denis knew it. The propaganda that fueled the war machine was relentless. The officers spoke of protecting the motherland, of rooting out enemies and restoring Russian glory. Denis didn't believe the words, but he also knew better than to question them aloud. To do so was to risk not just punishment but isolation, a fate worse than the grueling marches or endless drills. When the time came to deploy, Denis's reluctance turned to quiet resignation. He boarded the transport with the rest of his unit, his belongings packed into a single duffel bag. As the train rumbled out of Chusovoy, he stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape slip away. His mind raced with questions. How had it come to this? Could he have resisted harder? Would his family forgive him for going, or resent him for not trying to stay? The answers didn't matter now. He was no longer Denis from Chusovoy. He was a soldier, part of a war he didn't understand, fighting for a cause he didn't believe in. The reluctance that had marked his journey into the military was replaced by a grim acceptance. There was no turning back. He was on a path paved by coercion, fear, and the unrelenting march of a system that consumed its people without hesitation. Denis's first glimpse of Ukraine was through the narrow, mud-streaked window of a military transport truck. The vehicle jolted along uneven roads, the hum of its engine competing with the muffled conversations of nervous soldiers. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the propaganda-fueled rhetoric they had been fed. What Denis saw through the window didn't match the heroic imagery of liberation painted by his commanders. There were no cheering crowds, no warm welcomes, only cold, desolate fields and villages that bore the scars of conflict. When the truck stopped, Denis and his unit were ordered to disembark. The air was sharp and bitter, carrying the acrid smell of burnt metal and distant gunfire. The ground was frozen and unyielding beneath their boots. They had entered a small village that had once been vibrant, its cobblestone streets now littered with debris. Homes stood gutted, their walls blackened by fire. The few remaining civilians moved like shadows, their faces etched with fear and resentment. Denis kept his head down, avoiding their eyes. Their orders were simple: secure the village and hold the position. But simplicity in orders rarely translated to simplicity in execution. Denis's unit began clearing houses, kicking down doors and searching for weapons or hidden combatants. Inside one home, he saw a child's doll lying amidst the rubble, its porcelain face cracked. The kitchen table was set with plates of uneaten food, as if the family had fled mid-meal. These remnants of ordinary life unnerved Denis more than the occasional sound of gunfire. It wasn't long before chaos found them. The first ambush came without warning, a volley of bullets tearing through the frosty morning air. Denis hit the ground, his breath catching as he scrambled for cover. His training had been rushed, inadequate, and the reality of combat was nothing like the drills. Around him, men shouted conflicting orders, their voices laced with panic. Denis gripped his rifle tightly, his hands trembling as he tried to locate the source of the attack. In the confusion, a soldier near him fell, clutching his chest as blood seeped through his uniform. Denis froze, staring at the man's wide, terrified eyes. Someone screamed for a medic, but no one moved. Another explosion shook the ground, and Denis realized the attack wasn't just small arms fire. Mortars were falling now, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. He pressed himself against a low wall, his mind racing with fear and adrenaline. When the ambush subsided, Denis's unit regrouped, their numbers thinned and their morale shattered. The survivors spoke in hushed tones, some muttering prayers, others cursing their superiors. Denis kept silent, his thoughts consumed by the image of the fallen soldier. He had known the man only as Alexei, a quiet mechanic from a small town much like Chusovoy. They had shared cigarettes during the long transport, talking about home and the lives they had left behind. Now, Alexei's body lay lifeless in the dirt, a casualty of a war neither of them understood. As the days wore on, Denis's encounters with brutality became routine. He saw civilians rounded up and interrogated, their pleas falling on deaf ears. He witnessed homes set ablaze, the flames consuming not just buildings but the fragile remnants of normalcy. His own role in these acts was minimal. He followed orders, carried supplies, and occasionally stood guard. But his inaction weighed heavily on him. Each scene etched itself into his memory, a growing ledger of guilt. The turning point came one night when a shell landed close to their position. Denis was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. When he regained his senses, he saw the aftermath. A young woman lying motionless in the street, her body twisted unnaturally. She had been running, likely fleeing the destruction, but hadn't made it far. Denis stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his rifle hanging uselessly at his side. By the time the order came to move on to their next position, Denis felt hollow. The chaos of the front lines had stripped away any illusions he might have held about the war. This wasn't a fight for liberation or honor. It was destruction, senseless and unrelenting. And he, Denis from Chusovoy, was now a part of it, his hands stained by association if not direct action. The war had claimed him as much as it had claimed its victims. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural in the chaos of war. Denis and his unit had been stationed on the outskirts of a small village, huddled in makeshift trenches hastily dug into the frozen earth. The cold bit at their fingers and toes, but they dared not light a fire, knowing it could draw unwanted attention. They were told reinforcements were coming, that the artillery would secure their position. What no one told them was that the artillery would soon be aimed at them. It began without warning, a deafening roar that shattered the stillness. The first shells landed mere meters away, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. Denis instinctively threw himself flat, his face pressed into the icy mud as the ground shook beneath him. The air was filled with the sharp, metallic tang of explosives, and the screams of his comrades cut through the chaos like jagged glass. Incoming. Someone yelled, though it was already too late. Another shell exploded, and Denis felt the heat against his back, the force of the blast lifting him slightly off the ground. He scrambled toward what little cover he could find, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Around him, men were shouting, crying, cursing, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. The enemy wasn't attacking. This was their own artillery. Denis peeked over the edge of the trench and saw the devastation. The truck carrying their ammunition was engulfed in flames, sending sporadic bursts of shrapnel into the air as rounds cooked off. A soldier ran past him, his uniform torn and bloody, clutching at his arm where a jagged piece of metal protruded. Others lay motionless in the snow, their bodies twisted unnaturally. "Stop firing. We're friendlies," someone bellowed into a radio, but the shelling continued. Denis watched as a nearby tree splintered under the force of a direct hit, its branches crashing down onto what remained of a command post. He recognized the man beneath the rubble. It was their lieutenant, the one who had barked orders with such authority just hours before. Now, he was silent, his body pinned beneath the wreckage. Amidst the carnage, Denis spotted his closest comrade, Granev, crawling toward him. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were sharp with determination. "Move," Granev yelled, pulling Denis by the sleeve. Together, they stumbled toward the remnants of a barn they had used for cover earlier. Behind them, another shell landed, the shockwave knocking Denis off his feet. Inside the barn, the air was thick with dust and smoke. Denis pressed himself against the wooden wall, his chest heaving. Granev sat beside him, tearing a strip of cloth from his jacket to wrap around his bleeding head. "What the hell are they doing?" Denis muttered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. Granev shook his head, his expression grim. "They think we're dead already," he said flatly. "Or worse. They don't care." The shelling finally stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Denis and Granev ventured out cautiously, their movement slow and deliberate. The scene before them was one of utter devastation. What had once been their defensive position was now a smoldering wasteland. Bodies lay scattered among the wreckage, their forms illuminated by the flickering flames of what little remained of their supplies. Denis found himself standing over the remains of a comrade, a young soldier named Mikhail, who had shared stories of his family back home during their long nights on watch. His helmet was dented, his face unrecognizable beneath the blood and soot. Denis turned away, bile rising in his throat. He couldn't afford to break down. Not here, not now. As dawn approached, the survivors regrouped, their numbers painfully reduced. Someone had finally managed to get through to command, and the artillery had ceased fire, but the damage was done. Of the 70 men in Denis's unit, fewer than 20 were still standing. Their reinforcements never arrived. Denis didn't know whether to feel anger, despair, or simply relief that he was alive. The confusion of that night, the chaos of being shelled by their own side, became a defining moment for him. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was the shattering of any illusions he still held about the war. The enemy wasn't just the Ukrainians they had been sent to fight. It was the system that had placed them here, ill-equipped, poorly informed, and utterly expendable. In the days that followed, Denis's mind returned to that night over and over. The faces of the dead haunted him, their lives snuffed out not by an enemy's bullet, but by the indifference of their own forces. The memory became a scar, as deep and enduring as the physical wounds he carried. It was a reminder that in this war, survival often had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with sheer, unrelenting luck. As Denis recounts his time on the front lines, his words falter under the weight of the interviewer's sharp questions. His voice is steady, but his eyes betray him, a flicker of shame, a hint of defensiveness. He wants to appear innocent, a mere pawn in the machinery of war. Yet, with each answer, the cracks in his narrative widen, exposing a darker truth. "We didn't have a choice," Denis says, his tone measured. "There wasn't enough food. Our supplies were destroyed, and we had to take what we could to survive." The interviewer leans forward, his voice cutting through Denis's justifications like a scalpel. "You mean looting, don't you? Taking from the homes of people whose lives you'd already destroyed?" Denis shifts uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. "We didn't harm anyone. The houses were empty. We only took what we needed. Food, blankets, things to stay alive." The interviewer doesn't let up. "And when you entered those homes, did you think about the families who lived there? The mothers and children forced to flee because your unit had turned their village into a battlefield." Denis hesitates. "We didn't know what happened to them. We weren't told anything. We just followed orders." The room falls silent for a moment before the interviewer presses further. "Tell me about the farmhouse, the one with the broken door and the family photographs you stepped over. Did you think about the people in those pictures? Or did you only think about the bread on the table?" Denis exhales sharply, his mask of composure slipping. "We didn't mean to desecrate anything. It was survival." The interviewer's expression hardens. Survival? Or convenience? Because it wasn't just bread, was it? Jewelry, electronics, even keepsakes, things that had nothing to do with staying alive. Do you call that survival too? Denis's silence is deafening. His hands, clasped tightly in his lap, tremble slightly. He opens his mouth to respond but closes it again, unable to find the words to counter the accusations. The interviewer seizes the opportunity to drive the point home. "You say you had no choice, but choices were made. You took what didn't belong to you. You participated in the dismantling of people's lives. And now, sitting here, you expect me to believe you were just a victim of circumstance." Denis finally speaks, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to be there. None of us did. They put us in an impossible position. What were we supposed to do?" The interviewer leans back, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its edge. "You were supposed to see those homes, those photographs, those reminders of a life interrupted, and remember that you were the one interrupting it. Instead, you chose convenience over conscience, and now you want to hide behind orders?" Denis stares at the floor, his shoulders slumped. The weight of his actions, so easily dismissed in the moment, now presses down on him with unbearable force. He tries to speak again, but the words catch in his throat. The interviewer's next question lands like a hammer blow. "Do you know what happened to the people whose homes you looted? Do you care? Or are they just another consequence you can't bear to think about?" Denis doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. The silence is enough. His justification for his actions, once so confident, has unraveled under the scrutiny of someone who refuses to let him escape accountability. The war, Denis realizes, didn't just strip him of his innocence. It stripped him of his humanity. And no amount of excuses can change that. The capture was swift and brutal, a moment Denis would replay in his mind over and over again, each detail seared into his memory. It began with a retreat. His unit had been ordered to fall back after another devastating assault, this time by Ukrainian forces who seemed to know their every move. Denis and the few remaining members of his unit staggered through a maze of fields and ruined buildings, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel and gunpowder. They were low on ammunition, morale, and options. Denis had barely registered the ambush when it happened. Ukrainian soldiers emerged from the shadows with precision, their shouts breaking the tense silence. "Lay down your weapons." The command was sharp, unyielding, and left no room for resistance. Denis froze, his rifle slipping from his grasp and hitting the ground with a dull thud. Around him, his comrades did the same, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Hands were yanked roughly behind his back, bound tightly with plastic zip ties that bit into his wrists. Denis was shoved to the ground, his cheek pressed into the cold dirt. He could hear the hurried voices of the Ukrainian soldiers. some barking orders, others securing his comrades. One soldier knelt beside Denis, checking him for weapons. The man's eyes lingered on the insignia on Denis's uniform before meeting his gaze. There was no hatred in those eyes, only a steely resolve that made Denis feel small and exposed. They were marched to a nearby building that had been turned into a makeshift command post. The walk was humiliating. Barefoot after his boots had been taken, his head bowed to avoid the glares of passing civilians. The people stared, their faces a mix of anger and quiet triumph. Some shouted curses. Others simply watched in silence, their presence an unspoken judgment on the invaders now rendered powerless. Inside the command post, Denis was shoved onto a wooden chair in a dimly lit room. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat and damp concrete. A man entered, his uniform clean and his posture commanding. He carried no weapon, but his mere presence was enough to silence the room. This was the interrogator. The first question was simple. Name. Denis, he said, his voice cracking. Denis Sokolov. The interrogator leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. Rank. Unit? Denis hesitated, glancing at the other soldiers in the room. Some had already begun answering, their voices barely above whispers. He swallowed hard. Private. Machine gunner. Attached to the 59th Tank Regiment. The questions came faster after that. Where he had been deployed, the positions of his unit, their objectives. Denis tried to offer only what he thought they already knew, but the interrogator's unflinching gaze made it difficult to hold anything back. The man had a way of pausing just long enough for Denis to second-guess himself, to feel the weight of his omissions. Why did you come here? The interrogator asked, his voice sharper now. Did you think you were liberators? Protectors? Denis's mouth went dry. I didn't know. We were just following orders. The interrogator's expression darkened, his voice rising slightly. Following orders to kill civilians. To destroy homes? Is that what you tell yourself? No. Denis stammered, his hands trembling despite the tight bindings. I didn't. Then what did you do? The interrogator pressed. What did you think would happen when you crossed that border with a gun in your hands? Denis had no answer. The words tangled in his throat, refusing to come out. The silence stretched between them, oppressive and final. The session ended as abruptly as it began. Denis was escorted to a small room, stripped of his uniform, and given a plain set of clothes. The plastic ties were replaced with metal cuffs, and a single guard stood watch by the door. Alone in the dim light, Denis felt the enormity of his situation sink in. He was no longer a soldier, no longer part of a unit. He was a prisoner of war, a captive in a conflict that had consumed him without mercy. His first interaction with the Ukrainian soldiers had shattered any illusions he might have clung to. They weren't the monsters the propaganda had made them out to be. They were disciplined, controlled, and, above all, human. In contrast, Denis felt like a shell, stripped of his identity and left to confront the choices that had brought him here. Denis sat in the dim room, his hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. The interviewer's voice, steady and precise, broke the heavy silence. So, Denis, you've told us you didn't want to be here, that you were forced into this war. Do you truly believe that absolves you of everything you've done? Denis shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I had no choice, he began, his voice low and measured. They called me up. Refusing wasn't an option. I would have faced prison or worse. The interviewer raised an eyebrow, his tone unyielding. No choice? Is that what you told yourself when you crossed the border into Ukraine, weapon in hand? That you were just another pawn? Yes, Denis replied quickly, as though the speed of his answer would make it more believable. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just followed orders. The interviewer leaned forward, the edge in his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. Orders like looting homes? Like rounding up civilians? Tell me, when you broke down doors and ransacked kitchens, whose orders were those? Did someone command you to take jewelry and electronics along with bread and water? Denis hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. We needed supplies to survive, he said finally. The rest, I didn't take anything that wasn't necessary. The interviewer's eyes narrowed. So the electronics weren't necessary? The valuables weren't necessary? What about the lives disrupted by your actions? Were those disruptions necessary too? Denis didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, his silence speaking volumes. The interviewer let the pause linger before pressing on. Let's talk about Kharkiv, the interviewer said, his tone softening slightly, though the weight of his words was no less intense. You say you didn't want to hurt anyone, yet you were stationed in an area where artillery reduced homes to rubble, where civilians fled in terror. What did you think was happening when you fired your weapon? Denis's shoulders slumped. I didn't think, he admitted. We were under fire. It was chaos. I just did what I was trained to do. The interviewer leaned back, his gaze unrelenting. And what about the civilians you say you didn't see? The ones you say you didn't know were there. Did you ever stop to question why families were running from their homes? Why entire neighborhoods were abandoned? Denis opened his mouth, but no words came. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the stark light of the room. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice barely audible. No one told us what we were doing. We were just there. The interviewer didn't miss a beat. No one told you? Or you didn't want to know? There's a difference, Denis. You were there, firing your weapon, watching the destruction unfold, and now you sit here and claim you had no idea what you were part of? I didn't have a choice, Denis repeated, his tone growing defensive. You don't understand what it's like. If we refused, we were punished. They threatened us. They said if we didn't do our jobs, we'd be left behind. The interviewer's voice grew colder, each word striking with precision. Left behind by whom, Denis? By your commanders, the same ones who sent you into a war you claim you didn't believe in? Or by your own sense of morality? The one you ignored every time you followed an order you knew was wrong. Denis's face twisted in frustration. You don't know what it's like to be there, he said, his voice rising. To feel like you're nothing, like you don't matter. The interviewer's expression remained calm, unyielding. And what about the people you invaded? The families whose lives were torn apart by your actions? Did they matter to you? Or were they just another obstacle in a war you chose not to question? Denis's head dropped, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He didn't answer. The silence hung heavy in the room, punctuated only by the faint hum of the building's fluorescent lights. You want to portray yourself as a victim, the interviewer said finally, his tone softer but no less pointed. And maybe you are, of a system that used you and discarded you. But that doesn't absolve you of what you've done. You crossed that border. You pulled that trigger. And now you have to live with the consequences. Denis looked up, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. For the first time, his bravado was gone, replaced by a flicker of something raw and unguarded. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come. The truth lay bare between them, undeniable and unrelenting. The interviewer didn't press further. He didn't need to. The contradictions in Denis's story had already unraveled, leaving him to grapple with the reality of his own complicity, a reckoning he could no longer avoid. Denis sat in the dimly lit room, his hands resting on the table, his fingers nervously tapping against the wood. The interviewer's relentless questioning had carved deep into his carefully constructed defenses, leaving his justifications hollow and fragile. Each word, each memory he recounted, seemed to pile weight onto his shoulders. The mask of victimhood he wore was slipping, and beneath it lay a man struggling to reconcile his actions with his crumbling sense of self. The interviewer leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. Denis, you've said that you followed orders because you had to, that you didn't have a choice. But let's go deeper. When you were ordered to fire at those positions, when you knew civilians might be there, did you ever hesitate? Did you ever think about what you were doing? Denis's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He took a long, shaky breath. I didn't think. We were told it was an enemy position. We were told there were no civilians left. And you believed that? The interviewer asked pointedly. Even when you saw homes destroyed? Even when you saw the bodies? I didn't have a choice, Denis snapped, his voice rising in desperation. If I didn't follow orders, they would have punished me. You don't understand what it's like. The interviewer's gaze didn't waver. You're right. I don't understand what it's like to follow orders that go against everything I know to be right. But do you know what I do understand? That you had moments where you could have stopped, where you could have questioned what you were doing. Did you ever think, even for a second, that what you were doing was wrong? Denis clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the table. He wanted to deny it, to insist that he had no time to think. But memories flooded his mind, unbidden and relentless. The first was the image of a young woman running from the wreckage of her home, her child clutched tightly to her chest. Denis had watched from his position as artillery fire rained down on the village. He had told himself she was just another fleeing civilian, that she would be safe once she was out of the combat zone. But the sound of her scream, the way she fell to the ground, haunted him. He knew it had been their fire. He had done nothing to stop it. I thought about it, Denis admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. But it was too late. By the time I realized, it was already done. The interviewer pressed on. And after After you saw what was happening, did you ever try to refuse? To say no? Denis shook his head. You don't understand. Refusing wasn't an option. They made examples of people who disobeyed. Examples. The interviewer's voice hardened. What do you mean by examples? The interviewer's voice hardened. What do you mean by examples? Denis hesitated, his hands trembling. There was a soldier in another unit he refused to fire during an operation. They took him behind the trucks, and we never saw him again. They told us he had been sent back, but everyone knew the truth. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Denis's confession settling like a stone. The interviewer leaned back, his gaze unrelenting. So you were afraid of what would happen to you. But what about the people in those villages, Denis? Weren't they afraid too? Didn't they deserve the same humanity you wanted for yourself? Denis's head dropped, his shoulders slumping under the weight of guilt. I didn't think about them, he whispered. I didn't let myself think about them. If I did, I wouldn't have been able to do it. The interviewer's voice softened, but his words remained sharp. And now that you've seen what your actions have caused, do you think about them? Do you see their faces when you close your eyes? Denis nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. Every night, he said, his voice cracking. I see them. The ones who ran, the ones who didn't make it. I see the homes we destroyed, the lives we ruined. I see all of it. And what do you tell yourself now? The interviewer asked. Do you still believe you had no choice? Or do you understand that every order you followed, every shot you fired was a choice you made? Denis didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of guilt pressed down on him, a suffocating reminder of every moment he had tried to ignore, every excuse he had told himself. His hands covered his face as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. There was no escape from the truth now. He wasn't just a victim of the war. He was complicit in its horrors, and the burden of that realization was more than he could bear. Denis stared at the table, his hands motionless. The interviewer's next question hit with surgical precision. You've mentioned that you didn't fully understand why you were sent to Ukraine. Let's talk about that. What did they tell you back home? What did you believe? Denis's brow furrowed, his gaze still fixed downward. They told us we were defending Russia, he began, his voice hollow. That Ukraine was run by radicals, by Nazis. That we had to protect the people there, the ones who were still loyal to us. The interviewer's expression was impassive, but his words were sharp. And you believed that. You believed you were liberators. At first, yes, Denis admitted, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The news, the speeches, it was everywhere. They made it seem like we were the heroes, like we were saving people. But when you arrived, the interviewer pressed, did it still feel like you were saving anyone? When you saw the destruction, the fleeing families, the resistance from civilians, did it still feel like heroism? Denis hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for an answer. It didn't make sense anymore. The villages we went through, they didn't look like places that needed saving. People were afraid of us, not grateful. They weren't radicals. They were just families trying to survive. The interviewer leaned forward, his tone growing sharper. So why didn't you question it sooner? Why didn't you ask yourself why your actions didn't match the stories you were told? I don't know, Denis replied, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it wasn't true. If I did, if I admitted we were wrong, I don't know how I would have kept going. The room fell silent for a moment before the interviewer continued. Let's talk about what they told you back in Chusovoy. You grew up in a system that taught you to see the world a certain way. That Russia was strong, righteous, under threat. That Russia was strong, righteous, under threat. How much of that shaped who you are? Denis shifted uncomfortably, the question clearly striking a nerve. It was everywhere, he said after a long pause. School, TV, newspapers. They all said the same thing. That the West wanted to destroy us. That Ukraine was just a puppet of NATO. We didn't question it because it felt like the truth. And now, the interviewer asked pointedly, after seeing what you've seen, do you still believe it? Denis's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know what to believe anymore, he admitted. Everything they told us, it doesn't match what's real. But it's hard to let go of something you've believed your whole life. The interviewer didn't let him off easily. Hard to let go, or hard to admit you were part of the machine that spread those lies. Because the propaganda didn't just make you a soldier, Denis. It made you complicit in everything that followed. Denis flinched at the words, the weight of them settling heavily on his shoulders. "I didn't choose this," he said weakly. "They lied to us. They used us. They did." The interviewer agreed, his voice steady. "But you didn't ask questions, did you? You didn't stop to wonder if the people you were sent to fight were the real enemy. And because of that, you became exactly what the propaganda needed, a tool for destruction." The silence that followed was suffocating, the truth undeniable. Denis had spent his life steeped in a narrative designed to control him, to turn him into a willing participant in a war he barely understood. But understanding that didn't absolve him. It only deepened the tragedy of his complicity. As the interviewer prepared for his next question, Denis's expression shifted. There was no anger, no defense, only the hollow realization of a man confronting the lies that had shaped him and the reality they had concealed. The very fabric of his worldview, once so unshakable, was unraveling, leaving him exposed to a truth he could no longer deny. Denis's gaze hardened, though his voice wavered as he spoke. "We were told to move toward Kharkiv, to secure strategic positions and clear the area of resistance. They said it was vital for the operation, that we'd be welcomed as liberators. But when we arrived," he trailed off, his words swallowed by the weight of his memories. The interviewer didn't let the silence linger. "What did you see when you got there, Denis? What did liberation look like?" Denis swallowed hard. It didn't look like liberation. It looked like liberation. It looked like destruction. He described the streets of Kharkiv, once bustling with life, now unrecognizable. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to jagged ruins, their facades blackened by fire. Cars lay overturned, riddled with bullet holes, their shattered windows glinting in the pale sunlight. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning fuel. Bodies lay scattered among the rubble, some hastily covered with tarps, others left exposed to the harsh elements. The silence was eerie, broken only by the distant echo of gunfire and the occasional whimper of a stray dog. "We entered homes," Denis continued, his voice growing quieter, "not to help, but to take what we needed. Food, blankets, whatever we could find. Some of the houses were still burning. Others had been abandoned in a rush. Plates of food left on the table, children's toys scattered across the floor. It was like they had vanished in the middle of living their lives." The interviewer's tone turned sharper. "Did you ever stop to wonder where those families had gone? What had happened to the people who lived in those homes?" Denis hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "We didn't think about it," he admitted. "We couldn't. If we started asking those questions, we wouldn't have been able to do what they wanted us to do." The devastation wasn't limited to homes. Denis recounted how his unit was ordered to secure a hospital suspected of harboring resistance fighters. They moved through the building, room by room, their boots crunching on broken glass. The halls were eerily silent, except for the occasional groan of someone too weak to flee. Denis described finding an elderly man in one room, lying on a hospital bed, hooked up to a now useless IV. The man raised a trembling hand, as if to plead, but Denis's unit had no orders to assist. They left him there, alone and helpless. "You walked away," the interviewer said, his voice like a blade, "from a man who couldn't even stand. Did you think he was a threat? Or did you just not care?" Denis's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The destruction extended beyond the physical. Denis spoke of the psychological toll it took on his unit. The men grew increasingly paranoid, firing at anything that moved, convinced that every shadow concealed an enemy. He recalled one soldier, barely 19, who broke down after accidentally shooting a stray dog. "It looked like it was coming for me." The young soldier had sobbed, cradling the lifeless animal in his arms. Denis had tried to comfort him, but what could he say? That it didn't matter? That it wasn't human, so it wasn't worth grieving? He couldn't even convince himself. Then there was the artillery strike that turned an entire neighborhood into rubble. Denis had been stationed on a hill overlooking the city, tasked with manning a machine gun to hold the perimeter. From his position, he saw the first shells land. The explosions were deafening, the ground beneath him shaking with each impact. He could see figures running through the streets below, some carrying children, others clutching what few belongings they could grab. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He watched as a woman tripped and fell, her child tumbling from her arms. She scrambled to her feet, but the smoke swallowed her before Denis could see if she made it to safety. The interviewer's voice cut through his thoughts. "And you just watched? You didn't question why you were firing on a neighborhood full of civilians?" "I didn't fire," Denis said defensively. "I was told to hold my position." "But you didn't stop it either," the interviewer shot back. "You sat there and let it happen." Denis's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. What was I supposed to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. One man can't change anything. If I had refused, they would have killed me or sent me to the front lines alone. I didn't want to die. And what about the people in Kharkiv? The interviewer asked, his voice rising. Did they want to die? Did they deserve what happened to them because you were too scared to stand up? Denis couldn't meet the interviewer's gaze. The memories of Kharkiv, of the destruction his unit had left in its wake, were too vivid. He had told himself it wasn't his fault, that he was just following orders, that he was just trying to survive. But the truth was unavoidable now. He had been part of it, every burning building, every shattered family, every lost life. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating in its enormity. For Denis, Kharkiv was no longer just a city. It was a symbol of everything he had done, everything he had failed to stop. And no matter how far he tried to run from it, the ruins of Kharkiv would follow him, a reminder of the devastation he could never undo. Denis's voice softened as he spoke of his family, the weight of his words carrying more pain than anger. My mother, she won't speak to me. I've tried. They gave me one phone call after I was captured, and I called her, but she refused to answer. I haven't heard her voice since I left home. The interviewer leaned forward, his tone steady. Why do you think she won't talk to you? Denis hesitated, his hands fidgeting on the table. I don't know. Maybe she's ashamed of me. Maybe she blames me for everything. For going, for not resisting, for being here now. Or maybe... baby. She's ashamed of me for everything. For going, for not resisting, for being here now. Or maybe... His voice faltered, and he glanced away. Maybe she's afraid of what people will say if they know her son. For Dongder Ortislaud. Out of darkness, so the shadow.
His voice faltered. His voice was The interviewer asked. The interviewer asked. The interviewer asked.
Ludmila, a schoolteacher in Chusovoy, had raised him with a fierce sense of responsibility. She had always stressed the importance of doing what was right, even when it was hard. Denis's father, Anatoly, had been a welder at the steel plant until an injury left him unable to work. Denis spoke of watching his mother care for Anatoly, her quiet strength holding the family together. She worked so hard for us, Denis said, his voice tinged with regret. Even when we had nothing, she made sure we didn't feel it. She'd save every ruble she could, patch up my clothes, go without so that I didn't have to. The interviewer didn't interrupt, letting Denis continue. When the call-up came, she begged me not to go, Denis admitted. She said no good would come of it, that I'd just be another body in their war. But what choice did I have? I couldn't stay. Not when we were struggling to make ends meet. I thought I could help, send money back home. I thought I was doing the right thing. The interviewer's voice cut through Denis's reflection. Do you think she would have preferred the money? Or her son safe at home? Denis flinched at the question, the truth cutting deeper than any accusation. I thought she'd understand, he said, his voice cracking. I thought, maybe she'd forgive me. He recalled the phone call he was allowed after his capture, the anticipation and dread as he dialed the number. It rang and rang, each tone echoing in his ears. When the line finally connected, it wasn't Lyudmila who answered. It was his uncle. His voice was curt, dismissive. She doesn't want to talk to you, he had said before hanging up. Denis had stared at the phone in disbelief. The silence on the other end louder than any explosion he had heard on the battlefield. I don't blame her for hating me, Denis said quietly. She's right to. I left her to carry the weight of my decisions, the shame of what I've done. I left her to face the questions, the whispers, the judgment. I've made her life harder in every way. The interviewer didn't let him off the hook. Do you think she hates you? Or do you think she's grieving the son she thought she raised, the one who wouldn't become part of this? Denis's head dropped, his hands covering his face. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe both. The conversation turned to the broader impact on his family. Denis spoke of his younger sister, who had stayed in Chusovoy to care for their parents. She had written him a letter once, before the war, full of hope for the future. He hadn't written back, too caught up in the chaos of training and deployment. Now, he doubted she would write again. "She probably hates me too," Denis said. "I left her with all the responsibility, just like I left my mother." The interviewer's voice softened, but the weight of his words remained. "Do you think there's any way to repair what's been broken? To make amends for the choices you made?" Denis didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "I don't know if I can. Even if they forgave me, it wouldn't change what I've done. It wouldn't erase the things I've seen, the things I was a part of. How do you come back from that?" The room fell silent as Denis stared into the distance, his expression blank but his eyes heavy with emotion. His family had been his anchor, the one thing he thought he could hold on to. Now that anchor was gone, and he was adrift in a sea of regret. Ludmila's silence was louder than any condemnation, a reflection of the gulf his actions had created between them. For Denis, the fallout wasn't just about the war. It was about the chasm it had opened in his family, the bond he had taken for granted now severed by his choices. It was a reminder that while the war had consumed his life, it had also stolen something far greater, the love and trust of the people who had once been his refuge. Denis's days in captivity followed a monotonous rhythm, each one blending into the next. The mornings began early, with the faint light of dawn filtering through the small barred window of his cell. The room was cold and bare, its only furnishings a narrow cot and a metal chair. The walls, damp with condensation, seemed to close in on him more each day. Yet the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the weight he carried within. Breakfast was a simple affair: a piece of bread, some porridge, and a cup of weak tea. Denis ate in silence, his appetite dulled by the endless hours of reflection that stretched before him. The other prisoners, mostly members of his unit, sat together in the communal dining area, speaking in hushed tones. Conversations revolved around home, families, and the war that had brought them here. Denis rarely joined in. He found their attempts to avoid the subject of guilt suffocating. Instead, he kept to himself, his thoughts a constant storm of regret and self-recrimination. The guards, though watchful, treated the prisoners with a surprising degree of humanity. There were no beatings, no verbal abuse, only rules to follow and an unspoken understanding that any step out of line would not be tolerated. Denis found this strange. He had been told to expect the worst from his captors, yet they treated him with a restraint he hadn't known in his own army. Denis spent much of his time in a makeshift library, a small room filled with books donated by volunteers. He gravitated toward history and philosophy, desperate for something to help him make sense of his role in the war. One book, in particular, stayed with him, a collection of essays on morality in times of conflict. He read and reread passages about the thin line between following orders and personal accountability, each word cutting deeper into his conscience. He began to participate in discussions with his captors, Ukrainian officers who sought to understand the mindset of the Russian soldiers. These conversations were not interrogations but dialogues, opportunities to exchange perspectives. At first, Denis spoke cautiously, wary of their intentions. Over time, he found himself opening up, not to defend his actions but to explain them, and to listen. The officers were direct, asking pointed questions that forced Denis to confront the contradictions in his own narrative. One officer asked him, "When you pulled that trigger, did you think about who might be on the other side? Or did you tell yourself it didn't matter?" Denis didn't have an answer. He wanted to say he hadn't thought at all, but he knew that wasn't true. He had thought about survival, his own, and his unit's. But survival had come at a cost, one he hadn't fully realized until now. In the quiet moments of his captivity, Denis thought often of the people whose lives he had disrupted. He pictured the homes his unit had entered, the families they had displaced, the faces of civilians who had looked at him with fear and hatred. Their voices haunted him, fragments of pleas and screams that echoed in his mind. He couldn't escape them, even in sleep. His dreams were restless, filled with images of destruction and loss. Denis tried to find ways to atone, though his options were limited. He volunteered for every task he could: cleaning, organizing supplies, even helping repair damaged equipment. He worked tirelessly, hoping that his efforts might ease the burden of his guilt, if only slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. He also began to write letters, not to his family, who still refused to communicate with him, but to the people of Ukraine. The guards allowed him paper and a pen, and he poured his thoughts onto the pages. He wrote about his regret, his sorrow for the lives he had helped destroy, his hope that one day he might be forgiven, even if he could never forgive himself. Whether those letters would ever reach their intended recipients, Denis didn't know. Writing them was as much for him as it was for anyone else. Despite these attempts at redemption, Denis knew he couldn't undo what had been done. The lives lost, the homes destroyed, the families torn apart, they were scars that would remain long after the war ended. He often wondered if he deserved forgiveness, or if his actions had placed him beyond redemption. The thought gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the moral abyss he had helped to create. In the stillness of captivity, Denis was left with nothing but time and the memories he could not escape. Each day was a confrontation with his past, a struggle to find meaning in the ruins of his choices. And yet, amidst the despair, there was a sliver of hope, a belief that perhaps, through reflection and effort, he might begin to rebuild what the war had destroyed within him. It was a fragile hope, but for Denis, it was all he had. Denis sat quietly, his head bowed, as the interviewer's question echoed in the room. "Do you accept responsibility for what happened, Denis? For your part in this war?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Denis didn't answer immediately. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his fingers twisting as if searching for the courage he needed to respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to answer that." The interviewer pressed gently but firmly. "What do you mean? You don't know? You've told us about the homes you entered, the civilians who fled, the destruction you witnessed. You've said you followed orders. But following orders doesn't erase what you did. Do you take responsibility for your actions?" Denis exhaled shakily, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said, his tone pleading. "I didn't fire unless I was ordered to. I didn't. I wasn't like some of the others. I tried to stay out of it." "But you didn't, did you?" The interviewer replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "You crossed the border. You entered homes. You followed orders, even when you knew those orders would harm innocent people. Staying out of it wasn't an option. You were in it, Denis. Every step of the way." Denis's shoulders slumped, the weight of the interviewer's words pressing down on him. "I didn't think I had a choice," he murmured. "If I refused, they would have punished me. I thought I could just get through it, survive, and go home." The interviewer leaned forward, his tone softening but remaining firm. "And now, do you still believe that surviving was enough? That doing nothing to stop it absolves you?" Denis's silence spoke louder than any words. He closed his eyes, his face contorted with emotion. Memories flooded his mind, scenes of destruction, the faces of civilians, the screams he had tried to block out. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was just a pawn, that he hadn't truly been responsible. But now, faced with the undeniable truth, his defenses crumbled. "I should have done something," Denis admitted finally, his voice breaking. "I should have said no. I should have stopped it. But I was scared. I didn't know how to fight back." The interviewer nodded, his gaze steady. "Fear doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase the lives that were lost, the homes that were destroyed. You were afraid, yes, but so were the people whose lives you upended. And they didn't have the choice to walk away." Tears welled up in Denis's eyes as the full weight of his complicity settled over him. "I see their faces every night," he said, his voice trembling. "The people running, the ones we left behind. I told myself I was just doing what I had to do. But now I know I was lying to myself." The interviewer let the silence stretch, giving Denis the space to confront his thoughts. Finally, Denis spoke again, his tone more resolved, though still tinged with anguish. "I was part of the machine. I was part of the machine. I helped destroy lives. I see that now, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. Do you think that's enough?" The interviewer asked, his voice gentle. "To carry it with you?" "I don't know," Denis admitted. "It doesn't feel like enough, but it's all I can do. I can't take it back. I can't fix what I broke. All I can do is live with it and hope that someday someone might forgive me. Even if I can't forgive myself." The room fell silent again, the weight of Denis's confession settling heavily between them. For the first time, he had acknowledged his role in the atrocities, the choices he had made, and the consequences that had followed. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless, toward understanding, toward accountability, and perhaps, one day, toward redemption. The interviewer's voice carried a measured tone, firm but resonant, as he leaned forward to address Denis one final time. "This war, this destruction, has left scars on everyone it's touched. But it's not just about you, Denis. It's about accountability, about ensuring that this cycle of pain and devastation ends here." Denis nodded slowly, though his expression remained clouded with uncertainty. The interviewer continued, his words gathering weight. You've spoken about fear, about orders, about survival. But wars aren't fought in a vacuum. They're built on lies, on propaganda, on the silence of those who choose not to speak out. The people who made you a part of this war, who gave the orders, who unleashed destruction on innocent lives, they are the ones who must face justice. But so must those who carried it out, who chose to turn a blind eye, who followed orders without question. Denis opened his mouth to respond, but the interviewer raised a hand, stopping him. This isn't just about punishing those responsible. Accountability isn't revenge. It's a reckoning. It's about acknowledging the truth, about ensuring that the horrors of this war are not forgotten or repeated. The room was silent for a moment, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. The interviewer's voice softened, but its conviction remained unshaken. History has taught us, again and again, that wars don't start overnight. They begin with whispers of hate, with seeds of division, with the slow erosion of truth. And they end only when those responsible are held to account, not just the leaders, but every individual who played a part. That includes you, Denis. Denis's face was drawn, his eyes fixed on the table as the weight of the words settled over him. I want to make it right, he said finally, his voice cracking. But I don't know if I can. Making it right starts with truth, the interviewer replied. With owning your actions and understanding their impact. You've taken the first steps by admitting your role, by confronting what you've done. But accountability is not just about confession. It's about action. It's about ensuring that others don't repeat your mistakes, that the lies that brought you here are exposed and dismantled. The interviewer paused, his gaze unflinching. This war has left behind ruins of cities, of lives, of trust. But the most dangerous thing it could leave behind is silence. Silence allows history to repeat itself. Silence allows those responsible to escape justice. And silence prevents healing. Turning his attention fully to Denis, the interviewer asked, Do you understand that now? That your voice, your story, can be a part of that reckoning? That by speaking the truth, by acknowledging your complicity, you can help ensure that this never happens again? Denis nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the moment. I understand, he said quietly. I don't know if it's enough, but I want to try. The interviewer's tone softened, but the urgency in his words remained. It's not just about you, Denis. It's about every soldier, every civilian, every leader who has ever justified destruction in the name of orders or survival. This isn't just a lesson for you. It's a lesson for all of us. We must never stop questioning. Never stop holding each other to account. And never, ever let silence shield those who bring pain and suffering into the world. The room grew quiet once more, the finality of the interviewer's words hanging in the air. Denis looked up, his expression weary but resolute. For the first time, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a recognition of his place in the larger narrative, and the role he could play in ensuring its lessons were not forgotten. As the session concluded, the message was clear. Accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about justice, about truce, and about the collective responsibility to learn from history's darkest chapters. Denis's story was just one piece of that truth, a reminder of the human cost of war and the unrelenting need to confront it, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Only then could the world hope to break free from the cycles of violence and destruction that had claimed so many lives, including his own.